Well, something's happening, so we'll find out. Okay, so when I teach CGS 1821, I usually go through this whole like history of the web and stuff like that. I think most people in here kind of get a sense of the history of the web. So I'll give you the 5-minute version. There's a guy named Tim Berners-Lee, and he's working as a scientist. And if you've ever done a research paper, what do you usually have at the end? Like references and cited works and stuff like that. So think about back in the print days. If I have a work cited at the end, or references, or bibliography of some sort, and there's a paper, so let's say I'm a physicist, and I've referenced somebody else's paper in my paper, and somebody's reading it and they're like, oh, that seems like a cool paper. They would have to go to a journal. So if they're lucky and they're at a university, they could go down to their library, and maybe that library keeps that journal in, and then check out that issue if somebody else hasn't checked it out. And it was just a whole process. Well, what advantage do you have when things are electronic? If I have an electronic paper, do I have to actually march down to the library and do that? No, everything's electronic. It can be sent over the internet. And so kind of the core feature that really made the web special is that he came up, well, he didn't come up with the idea, but he kind of put it all together in a package, this idea of hyperlinks. That if I've got a research paper and I've got works cited, that if somebody wants to go to one of my works cited, all they have to do is click it, and it zooms over to that paper. Now, the unfortunate reality is that never really ended up happening for research papers, because a lot of that's behind paid journals and stuff like that. But we don't even think twice about it these days. Like if I go to Blackboard and I click my institution, I'm clicking a hyperlink. It's taking me somewhere. Okay. I tell you this background because the web grew up with scientists, and scientists are not exactly, especially research papers, are not exactly known for using very interesting like color and very interesting layouts and those sorts of things. They do the bare bones layout. It almost looks like newspaper layout, generally research papers. It's like you got blocks of text. If you're really lucky, you're going to have a couple of tables and diagrams, but that's really it. That's where the original web came in. Then further along, and so he was a scientist in Europe. Commercial entities started to realize that this could be useful for them. So one of the earliest adopters was Pizza Hut. And think about Pizza Hut's website versus a physics research paper. They're going to be very, very different layouts. They're going to have very different concerns. Pizza Hut's probably going to want to like very large graphics. They're probably going to want to have some cool layouts. They're probably going to have maybe some animation, those sorts of things. Versus a physics paper, you want it to just to be bare bones. So when Tim Berners-Lee created HTML, he essentially created the web. He didn't really create it with Pizza Hut in mind. He created it with physics papers in mind. So we went through these growing pains throughout so this was in, I think, like 89, 90, somewhere around there, maybe even 88. Went through this whole process, these growing pains of taking it from physics papers to making it interesting. And so the original HTML standard did a really poor job at layouts, fonts, those sorts of things. What they actually did was they built those things right into the HTML tags. And just HTML is really, really bad at that. And so I want to say it was maybe the late 90s. They took a step back and they said, okay, HTML is really, really, really good at structure. My go-to is always Wikipedia. It's very, very good at structure. Like this is a very highly structured document. I always start off with IRC and then, Wiki, UCF. I didn't go to UCF, don't worry, I have no particular love for UCF. They just have a very large wiki page. This is you can see this is very, very highly structured. These are all H1 tags. These would be H2s, H3s. Very, very highly structured stuff. So HTML is really, really good at structure. It's really, really bad at making gradients, animations, those sorts of cool, interesting things. So they took a step back and they said, let's stop pretending HTML is going to ever be good at these things. Let's create a completely separate standard just for doing stylistic things, layouts, and those sorts of things. And does anybody know the name of that standard? CSS, yeah. So cascading style sheets. When we're creating our web pages, we want to kind of have that separation in our head that HTML is really, really good at structure, but it's really, really bad at styling and layout. So we want to structure our pages in HTML, say, okay, this is going to be a paragraph. This is going to be an article. This is going to be an article with like an H1 inside of it. This is going to be a hyperlink. That tells me nothing about how that page looks, right? Because there's nothing inherent about how a paragraph looks. It's just a paragraph. I'm saying what it is. But then you might use CSS to say, okay, I want that paragraph to be indented. I want that paragraph to use this font. I want that paragraph to have this certain line height. CSS handles all those sorts of things. Then you can even get into some other look and feel things, okay? So keep that in mind as we go throughout the course. I realize a lot of that is review for some of you, but I know not everybody. I know I really try to drive that point home for CGS1821. But I realize not everybody necessarily had me. So it's a really, really important point. There's actually a cool site called CSS Zen Garden. Has anybody heard of that? And it's cool because what they do is they give you some HTML. You're not allowed to touch the HTML, but you're allowed to do whatever you want to the CSS, and you get these vastly different looking sites with the exact same HTML. It's really cool. But if you ever have time, check it out. I'm trying to stay a little bit focused today. So that's just the history. That kind of sets the stage. What I usually do is spend about the first 2 or 3 weeks reviewing. So just kind of an honest survey just by show of hands. How many people feel like you could use a little bit of HTML, CSS code review? Usually it's quite a few people. Okay. So I have a heart. I don't just jump right into new stuff. We usually spend about the first, I'll say realistically, about 3 weeks doing things I consider review. But then we go right into new material. Okay. So we're going to have to write all this HTML and CSS code. There's kind of 2 approaches that you can take. You can take a drag and drop editor. Unfortunately, along the way, you're not going to actually really learn anything. So I'll give a quick story. There used to be a tool called Microsoft FrontPage. Has anybody heard of this before? Okay, because Microsoft got rid of it many years ago. And people invested all this time into making front page websites. And it's very cool because it's what they call, it's a stupid acronym, but it's called a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. And it's like you kind of make a website by just dragging things around. You learn no HTML or CSS in the process, but you got an interesting looking website at the end. But then the problem is that at the end, Microsoft decided, hey, we don't care about this tool anymore. We're not going to support it. And you had a whole bunch of web people that kind of like were just out of luck. It's like they didn't really, a lot of them didn't know HTML. They had to start learning a new tool. So I don't want to teach you that side of it. What I want to teach you is, and you've probably known from those who've had classes before with me, is I think it's important to focus on the fundamentals, actually learning some HTML. You don't have to learn all HTML. You don't have to learn all of CSS. You just have to learn some basic techniques and get good at being creative and taking those basic techniques and putting them together for something, okay? But to actually write the HTML code, we need a text editor. Now, we could open up just Notepad and actually just start writing in that. But that's kind of a terrible way of doing things. Nobody really writes code like that. So what I like to use is an editor called Brackets. If you go to the course resources, I actually have a link to it. So one of the advantages to Brackets is they don't really like to announce it. It's actually an Adobe tool, and I know a lot of people in here like using your Adobe tools. It works equally well on Windows and Mac, so that you don't have to have any particular preference. Like right now, I'm just using a Windows laptop because I have my recording software set up here. But as we get going into the lectures, for the most part, there's not been a problem. I've been using brackets for a few years now. For the most part, people have been, it's pretty much the same software on Windows and Mac, so it's pretty cool there. And it has some extra nice little features that'll help us along. So if we go to the course here, under resources, okay. So if you're in Windows, like you have a personal Windows laptop, you can just click download. It'll auto-detect the operating system. On Mac, you can still click download, but on the school computers, they have them a little bit locked down. So you know how like in Mac, you can drag it into your applications? You can still open it, you just can't drag it into your applications. Does that make sense? So go ahead and click download. And then when you open it, it'll give you that little screen like, would you like to drag it in your applications? You just double click the brackets icon. Don't worry, we're not doing that today. Don't worry about that. So 2019. Okay, I'll give everyone a minute or two to get that downloaded and opened. Okay, so any questions so far? Is everyone kind of clear on the direction of the course? What we're going to be focusing on? I do want to make something clear. So I have to be careful with how I phrase this. So this is kind of a coding course in that we're going to be writing some HTML and CSS. I don't want to get into writing JavaScript. How many people really enjoyed writing JavaScript? Probably not very many, right? Okay. You can actually do a lot on the design side without having to write any JavaScript these days. It used to be that you'd have to write a lot of JavaScript to do anything useful or interesting. But these days with the modern standards with CSS and HTML5, it's getting to where you can do some really cool things without having to write any JavaScript anymore, okay? So I'm going to try to not to focus on doing any JavaScript. At the end, we will do some WordPress, and we'll create our own WordPress. They use the terminology theme, but you can kind of think of it as like a template. And there'll be some PHP, but...
Sorry for being late. I come from Jupiter. I'm Rudy Francisco.
Okay, yeah, just get set up. So we're going to not write PHP code, but there's going to be some copying and pasting. Okay, so it'll be, so I don't want to, give anybody anxiety about like, oh no, is this going to be another coding course? Not really. You're going to have to write HTML and CSS, which you've done a bunch of times, but I'm not going to make you write JavaScript. And any PHP code that we do in here, it'll just be like copy, paste, modify. It'll make sense when we do it. It'll be like, you'll take a chunk of maybe 10 lines of PHP code, and this is just for the WordPress part, because I want you to, a lot of people who use WordPress never actually create their own theme. They'll just use other people's themes. But I want to give everyone in here the ability to actually create your own WordPress theme. Now, that requires a little bit of PHP, but not really that much, and it's like just a tiny amount that you're just going to modify it and say, okay, rather than, it'll make sense when we get to that part of the course, but that's about the extent of the actual scripting that we're going to do. Everything else is going to be just HTML5 and CSS3. Okay. Did everyone get brackets downloaded and opened? And if you find your neighbor struggling a little bit, everyone in here is out to help each other, so just kind of help them out. so while you're finishing getting that done, let me just add a link to W3 Schools here. And another site we're actually going to use a lot is going to be HTML shell. Because I don't want to get into making you write this every single time. The chances that you write it perfect, everyone in here writes this boilerplate code perfect every single time is pretty low. So what we'll often do is just take this code right here. This will be our starting point, so let me add a link to that as well. And what I mean by boilerplate code is just code that is the same every single time. We're not going to be really doing very much with it. It's just kind of like the head section and the title and that sort of stuff we don't really care about right now. Okay, so what I usually suggest that you do for this course, and I guess probably most of your courses, is create a dedicated folder for all of our examples. So I'm going to make it on my desktop, which is probably a pretty terrible place to put it. If you have a flash drive or an external hard drive or somewhere to put that, that'd be a good place to have that. And the one suggestion I always give to everyone is please follow my naming conventions. So what I mean by that is, like, I'll name the class CGS4828. And then the examples for today, I would call it like 1/13/2020. When I've seen people not follow those conventions, they end up with weird situations where they've got like their first assignment in 3 different spots and they don't know which one is actually their first assignment, and they turn in wrong files and stuff like that. So please do your best to stay organized. If you just kind of follow along and use the same naming conventions that I use, like using dates or call your first assignment maybe like assignment 1, you know, things like that, you'll be in okay shape. It's when people just try to create a random file somewhere, like a random index.html somewhere. It might have been in their downloads, it might have been in their documents. That's usually when I see people get to where they like don't even know which file is their latest version, and they have some version at home somewhere that they put onto a flash drive that they don't, you know. So just try to stay organized. So I'm going to make a new folder. It's just going to be called CGS4828, the class. Right, that's it, 4828, I think. Yeah. And then for today, let's go ahead and just make a folder with today's date. Be careful with the naming of dates. So you can do like 1-13-2020, but generally you can't use like 1/ like that. It causes other problems. So make sure to use dashes in your dates. Okay, so I try not to move on until everyone's on the same page. So everyone got brackets downloaded. You're actually able to, You're actually able to open it up, correct? Okay. And mine just says error because it doesn't exist. And you've gotten your CGS4828 folder with today's date created. Okay. So let's just start off with some basic stuff here. Well, let's do this. Okay, so you'll have a little, it's very hard to describe. I don't know what this thing is called. It's kind of like a button. You click it, and mine says getting started, but yours might point somewhere. But you should have this option to open a folder. If you point brackets to that folder that you just created, it's very, very, very difficult to make organizational mistakes, like putting stuff in the wrong place. So again, I have brackets open. Mine says getting started, but yours might say something else, like a date or something like that. I click open folder. In my case, I put it on my desktop, which again is probably not a great place to put it, but it works well for lecture. And then point it to today's date, so this folder that we just created. I realize things are going to be a little bit different on Macs, but once we get going, those little differences go away very quickly. Okay, so you got brackets open, you got your folder created, you took brackets and you actually pointed it to that folder. Now let's go ahead and make our first HTML file. So let's go to File, New. It's very important. So before we actually write any code in here, let's go ahead and save it. So File, Save. Notice that it put it in the correct spot. You don't have to go and find your CGS4828 and all that stuff. Because we pointed it there, it defaulted to this folder. That's really, really useful for us. Usually what I do is I'm kind of lazy about the naming. I'll just like the first example for today would be ex1.html, then ex2.html, ex3, and so on. So the first example is going to be ex1.html. Make sure you actually put in that .html part. That's very important. That's the file extension. If you just put in ex1, it doesn't know what kind of file it is. Okay, the file extension is basically like a hint to the operating system that says, okay, this is an HTML file. If we just have ex1, it doesn't really have any reasonable way to understand that it's an HTML file. Okay, so we got brackets open. We got a pointing to the folder. We just made our ex1.html file. Just to confirm, we could always go in here and say, okay, I'm going to go into my folder for today and look at that. We see our ex1.html. Yours, if it's hiding file extensions on the file system, you may not actually see the .html part, but you get the idea. And now let's, under resources, let's go to HTML shell. I'm pretty sure this is full length course. Yeah, okay. Sometimes what they'll do is I'll get like a blended class that's like 2 hours instead of the full 2.5 hours. And realistically, the first week we're probably going to get out of here a little bit early. It's just the practicalities of the first week. Okay, so you got this HTML shell open, and not like it matters a whole lot, but you can go ahead and that's new. We'll just leave it as title. And just copy and paste that code in there. Doesn't really matter what the title is because we're not going to be at that level of detail. So a lot of times I see code mistakes for really stupid reasons. Meaning that like the code was just difficult to read and you made a mistake because you couldn't read your own code. Code organization is really, really, really important. The basic idea is that every time we've got a tag, we want to indent a level. So notice that we've got HTML. Well, within inside of HTML, it indented the head tag. Well, within head, we have meta and title, but title was just on one single line. And then anything we put inside of body needs to also be indented. This is really important. And when I first started, I used to kind of really make a big deal about this to do it manually. But these days we have a lot of plugins that can kind of assist you. That doesn't mean you can write terrible code and it'll automatically format it for you, but it does a halfway decent job of if you're off by a couple of indents or something like that, it does a pretty good job. Because we've installed brackets before on these computers and other classes, it might already be there. But for anybody else, or maybe you've got your own personal computer, if you go under, I'm not sure what this is supposed to look like, a battery or I don't know what. To me, it looks like a Lego. It's called the Extension Manager. And there's an extension called Beautify. Has nothing to do with the course itself, but and if you actually just type in the word Beautify and hit enter, it'll search for it. I'm going to update it. Okay. But go ahead and install that. How many people already had that installed? I think most people. Yeah. Oh, actually not as many as I thought. So it's a super, 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 okay, so I'm going to update and reload. Save, yes. Okay. It's a really, really, really useful extension because it makes your code much, much more readable. Hopefully you can tell just by the name. It's called Beautify. It makes the code considerably easier to read. Easier code to read means less mistakes. Something else that we can do to make our code easier to read is make the font sizes large. It always amazes me that, I'll see beginning students trying to write code like this. And even advanced people, I code with large fonts just because it's very, very easy to spot mistakes. Not obnoxiously huge, I'm not like this or anything like that, but large enough that you can see mistakes. Because the smaller the fonts, I might be able to read text at a small font, but coding is like a different story altogether because you're looking at if one little character is off, it's going to potentially cause big problems. Now, one of the nice features that this Beautify has, oh, by the way, for those that don't know, so on my Windows computer, it's Control plus. I think it's Command plus and Command minus. Try that on your computers. Did that work? Okay, so Command plus, Command minus. Doesn't need to be huge, but large enough that you could spot mistakes. If you go over to Edit, they actually have a feature here called Beautify on Save. And so every time you save your code, it'll automatically format it to try to make it a little bit more readable. There's certain rules. Like I said, every time you hit a tag, you're supposed to go indent one level and so on. But, okay. And so now if I were to save it, well, it automatically beautified it, but you get the idea. This is a really, really, really useful extension. Don't underestimate how many mistakes can be prevented just by having organized, readable code. Okay. So I think most people in here, you're very familiar with all the various tags. We could go through W3 Schools. I think has like a just a complete listing of common tags. Or just Google it. Maybe this one. Here's a complete listing, but this might be a little bit too, I don't even think it's organized in any sort of way. Okay. So the basic unit of HTML, I guess you'd say, is the HTML element. Sometimes I'll kind of use the element and tag interchangeably. They're probably not the same thing, but whatever. So sometimes you just have to be more concerned about producing things than definitions and that sort of thing. So there are two basic families of tags. We've got block level and inline. So can anybody name some block level tags? Paragraph, perfect. Any others? What's that? Header, perfect. The H1 through H5 family. Okay. And what makes a block level tag a block level tag? Okay, so before we answer that, everyone's familiar with lorem ipsum, right? Let's make a couple of paragraphs, and I'll go ahead and post this. You can Google it, but this one's a pretty popular generator. So you can just Google lorem ipsum, or I just added a link to it as well. And let's just grab one single lorem ipsum paragraph here, and I'll probably chop it down a little bit. So what I want to do with that is I want to put it in a paragraph, because we just said that, okay, a paragraph is a block level element. Notice that it automatically did that beautify for me. I didn't. So within body, I had paragraph, and it automatically indented paragraph. And then this block of text inside of paragraph, it automatically indented that as well. So let's copy and paste this. Normally, you'd probably want to grab a new lorem ipsum paragraph, but just keep our lives simple for now. So I've got 2 paragraphs. Now, one of the nice things about brackets, this is just kind of a side note, is that it's got actually a built-in web server. So when I first started teaching this course, when we kind of had our really, really basic tools, we'd have to actually go in here, find our ex1.html, view it. But with brackets, they actually have a built-in web server that we can actually, I guess that kind of looks like a lightning bolt type thing. I don't know what it's supposed to be. But it's a live preview, and that'll start up a web server for you. That way you don't have to find it on your file system and so on. Okay, so I'm going to make the fonts really large, but that's just for demonstration purposes. Your fonts will probably be small. So after the first paragraph, are the first paragraph, so just to let you know, this is kind of considered like, well, I don't want to be overly confusing. What happens after the first paragraph? Is it on the same line, or did it start a new line?
It's on the same line.
Well, so this whole thing, this is the first paragraph. Is the second paragraph, did it start a new line? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically the definition of a block level tag. Anything that after that tag, it starts a new line. Well, you might think, okay, well, what is an example of something that's not a block level tag? So the opposite of block level tag is what? Inline. And the idea of an inline tag is that it doesn't have that effect. Does anybody remember any inline tags? Yeah, so bold. Just kind of as a side note, we're going to avoid bold and italic. The reason being is because, remember I told you HTML is good at structure, but it's not good at saying how things look. So what might we want to use instead of bold? That has basically the same effect. I heard somebody say it. Strong, perfect. Because this says, so strong, that kind of tells us something about the structure. It's saying that I want this to be strong. Or instead of italics, we would use EM. You're saying I want to put emphasis on this. This may seem like a minor point, but later on we can see with CSS, we can do things like take the bold tag and make it so that the text in the tag isn't actually bold anymore. And so you end up with these kind of weird, useless tags that you can modify with. So you kind of want to say what it's doing, but we'll talk about that later. What do you notice after, so our strong tag was right here. Is the text after the word ipsum, is that on the same line, or did it start a new line? Same line. So that's the difference. Block level tag drops down a new line. Inline is literally just inline. Okay, that's going to be important once we get into something later called the box model. So that's just some basics with HTML. We'll go through all kinds of tags. Bless you. One more thing, let's, I guess, explore this idea that you can put tags within tags. So again, it's going to have structure. I want to say what it's describing. So if I'm writing a news article, I don't want to just have a bunch of random paragraphs. I might want to actually wrap it inside of this HTML element called article. Just as a side note, so notice that I had article here, and I got rid of the closing tag. If I hit the greater than sign, and then slash, it automatically closed that for me. And we also have syntax highlighting as well. You'll see that our HTML elements are blue and our regular text is not. We're going to be using tags within tags a lot in this class. Has anybody heard of div before? Show of hands if div sounds familiar. So can anybody describe what a div is? It's kind of vague, right? It's like, it's just, I couldn't fit it in any, it actually stands for division. It just means that there's some sort of division of content. It means it wasn't an article, it wasn't a paragraph, it wasn't a header, it wasn't a footer. It wasn't an aside, it wasn't, one of these many, many, many choices that we have. It's just like some sort of division of content. And we're going to be doing this a lot in this class where we have divs inside of divs inside of divs and so on. Okay. Let's touch on a little bit of CSS. So I'm going to go to W3 Schools CSS. Bless you. Okay. So there are 3 ways. So just as a very, very, very brief review of CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. The part about that acronym that we care about is the style. This is what's going to give our page layout and things like fonts and colors and so on. Now to actually include CSS inside of our page, there's 3 different ways to do it. There's external, internal, and inline. When I teach the classes, I typically don't do very much external, not because it's not important. External is actually very important. It just makes it's like one extra difficulty that we don't need for something to break. Internal and external are actually very, very similar. The main difference is that you take internal, you package it up in a file, you make it external, and you can reference that file instead of having to copy and paste code. But anyway, so right now let's just talk about inline. So if I wanted to add some inline CSS here, I use something called an attribute. So in this case, we have the style attribute. And let's just give that text some color. So hopefully you already see some of the advantages of using a text editor like Brackets versus like Notepad, is because Brackets was aware that we're actually writing some CSS, and it says, okay, here's some color suggestions, rather than actually have to map out hex colors or anything like that. And let's just pick something, doesn't really matter. Let's say dark sea green. And the idea is with inline CSS, for the length of this paragraph, this text is going to be dark sea green. So without actually kind of opening up the browser, let me just ask you some questions to kind of think through what's going on here. Is this second paragraph, is this going to be dark sea green?
No.
No. Why?
Because it doesn't know the style.
Exactly, yeah. So the inline style is only for the length of this first paragraph. As soon as we hit this other paragraph, it stops. Is the word ipsum, is that going to be dark sea green? Yes. Why? Exactly, because it's inside of this paragraph. So make sure you understand those some of those basic rules. But let's go to preview this and just make sure I'm not lying to you. And you can see that. Probably a bad color to choose because that's kind of difficult to see. But you can see that's like a greenish color, and that's just a regular black. Okay, so I want to start a new example in a second, but is everyone good so far? Is this kind of, the gears kind of turning, this starting to be familiar again? I start off slow because all this stuff builds on each other. So if you're bored, it'll pick up, but it's just, there's no point to the course if I kind of start right away and everyone's lost. It's not like you're going to catch up, you know? So everyone's got to kind of have the proper foundation, and then we can start to move on to do more interesting things, because in general in coding, everything builds on each other. So it's not like you can skip a subject. It's like you use that thing to build the next thing. So here we have our CSS. This is called a CSS property. There's a huge number of these properties. There's at least dozens. There's probably hundreds of these properties. We'll get into some of that detail in a little bit, but it's what we call a key value pair. So it's this idea that we've got a color. This is the colon, so it's like you hit the shift key and then hit the key next to the L, and then it needs a value. So we're saying that the color is going to be dark sea green, and then we end it with a semicolon. The reason we end it with a semicolon is that we can actually add multiple properties. So let's say we also wanted to underline. I think underline is text decoration, I think. Yeah. So you can see here that we've actually applied 2 CSS rules. Can everyone see that? Let me know if at any point I need to like click the lights one lower that you can see the projector. Would that help? Or can everyone see at the corners and backs and everything? Perfect. Okay. So now here we have 2 properties. We have the color and text decoration. And that's why we have these semicolons, is that each rule is separated out by that semicolon. Now don't worry about this. Notice when I'm clicking here and it's doing all kinds of things. This is specific to the built-in web server brackets. It has like some debugging functionality built in. If you ever want to just view your original page, you can just, on the file system, you can just double click, and this is what your page is actually going to look at. Like this is what your page is going to look like. I'm clicking around here, and notice that it's not like highlighting or anything. Okay. So that's inline. Let's make a internal style sheet. So any questions before we move on? Everyone good? Okay. So let's go to File, New. Save this as ex2.html, and then we'll copy and paste that HTML shell again. And then I'll give everyone a minute to catch up and get to this point. And let's go ahead and this time we're going to have an H1. Say my page. We're going to have a couple of paragraphs. So in these paragraphs, we're going to paste in some lorem ipsum text again. Doesn't need to be the full paragraph, just enough to kind of make the point. Dude, that's probably more than I care to have. Whatever. My touchpad's been acting up. I hope it's not on its last leg. So similar deal, but this time we've added our, an H1. So we just did inline CSS. Now let's look at internal CSS. The way internal CSS works is inside of this section called head, what we do is we add a tag called style. And anything we add in here, this is going to be our CSS. Now this is a little bit different because when we had our inline CSS, it started at the paragraph and ended with the when we closed out the paragraph tag. But this doesn't really make sense, because we're not starting and ending tags here. So the way it works is we use these things called selectors. And there are 3 types of selectors. There's the element selector, ID, and class. Let's start off with the element selector. The way it works is that we put the name of our element. In this case, we want to modify paragraph. We put the curly braces. And then now any CSS that we put inside of that curly braces, like we did earlier, remember we did like text decoration, underline, and color, that's going to apply to all paragraphs. So say, for example, I wanted the color to be red. So dark red. So before we actually run the page, just from what I've told you before that this is an element selector, what color is the first paragraph going to be?
Red.
What color is the second paragraph going to be? Also red. If I had added 50 other paragraphs, what would the 50th paragraph color be? Red. So what it's saying is that every single paragraph on this page apply this style. And we can see that. It's like this, it's dark red. But notice what color is the H1?
Black.
It's black, which is the default color. So only modified paragraph. And if we also wanted to add, say, font weight and make our paragraphs bold for whatever reason, or let's do this one. Let's do text indent. Or I think it's in pixels. Let's try a huge number and let's see how. Go from there. Okay, perfect. So this property, text indent, this just basically indents the block level tag, and I'm saying, okay, I want to indent 50 pixels. So these are element selectors. Let's say, for example, I wanted to apply an element selector to my H1. Can I apply color to an H1? Yeah. So a lot of these CSS properties you can reuse. It's not like there's something inherent about color that it only works on paragraphs. It's going to work on articles. It's going to work on headers and footers. It's going to work a lot of places, most places, okay? There's actually only a very, very tiny, small number of CSS properties that are specific to a certain element. Maybe something related to like hyperlinks or something, or something that's a little bit different. But for the most part, these generally can be used everywhere. So if I wanted to make this like some sort of bluish color, say sky blue, we can do that. So a lot of these properties are reusable. Okay, so a couple more examples and then we'll be done for today. I'm not going to give an assignment this week because people are like switching out classes and doing all kinds of enrollment things. So I don't want to give an assignment. We've already kind of done more than most classes do the first week anyway. So any questions on this? So this is called an internal style sheet. The way it works is you put the style tag inside of head, and then we put our rules. One quick note, so don't type this code because it's going to be wrong, but this is something that I see a lot of people do. You don't need to put style for every single selector. You just put it once and then that's it. And so if we had 50 rules here, we would put them all in just this one style tag, okay? This is just a common mistake that I see people make. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit more. Let's go back to HTML shell. So we're going to continue looking at internal style sheets. So we put it inside the head section. By the way, if you ever catch me, this is something I do a lot, is like when I'm lecturing, I accidentally put them between. I'll do this. So if you ever catch me doing that, you get a bonus point. Okay. So make sure you put it in the right section inside of head. Now we just talked about the element selector. I'm going to skip over ID. ID is a little bit complicated and I don't want to really get into it right now. For what we're doing in this class, ID actually doesn't really matter that much. ID is more like if you're going to be programming and you need to be, does anybody, when you took the JavaScript class, did you ever call a function called getElementById? Does that sound familiar? Okay. It's just, there's a special function called getElementById that you want it to return a single element back, and that's part of the reason we use IDs. I don't want to get into it right now, so let's just jump right over to class selectors. So let's say, for example, I have, let me just write some code. Okay, so I'm going to do .announcement. And what I'm saying here, so I did .announcement, and what I'm saying here is that I want its color to be red and italicized. And then say I've got a couple of H1s here. I'm just going to be generic. It's just going to be first announcement. Second announcement. So with the element selector, if I had applied it to H1s, all H1s would be red and italicized. But a lot of times that's not fine-grained enough for what we need. That's just too broad. It's like you're just turning everything a certain way. It's like sometimes we need to be a little bit more fine about how we do things. So that's where a class comes in. And what we can do is we can define a class and say, okay, I'm going to have a class called announcement. And then the way I actually use that, so right now if I were to load this up, you can see it just has the default styling. But now if I say class equals announcement, I can spell announcement, okay. You'll see that it's red and italicized. So the only text that's going to be red and italicized is when I actually use this class. Now notice that it's class equals announcement and not dot announcement. That's a very common mistake that I've seen people have in the past. Now what if I did this? If I had a paragraph that said the assignment is due Friday. Can I also make that paragraph a part of that announcement class? Yeah. So I can. So it turns out it's pretty useful because now it's like I can do more interesting things. In practice, you actually don't use the element selector that much. In practice, you're going to actually use this class selector a lot. So I want to get in one more example, but we're not going to have to do it from scratch. I'm just going to take this example, copy and paste it, and modify it a little bit. Sometimes it's nice just to have the steps along the way rather than just one giant example. But any questions on this before we move on? So just a quick 30-second review is that we started off with our inline styles, and those inline styles only apply for the, yes, sorry.
What's the period for in front of the announcement?
That's a good question. So if it didn't have that special character, it wouldn't know whether it's a class or an element. So it knows that if there's no period in front, it assumes that there's got to be some element named announcement, which there aren't. But as soon as it sees that special character, and then the same thing with ID, is that with ID, it actually has the hash symbol in front of it, and then the actual processor, when it sees that, and it sees that first character, says, I know that's an ID, or I know that's a class. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so we started off, we had our inline styles, and those are only valid for the length of the tag. So if I open a paragraph with some styling, as soon as I close it, the next paragraph's not going to have any of that styling. That's okay. It has limitations, and you should try to kind of use that sparingly. There are times you want to use that. Then we looked at our internal style sheets, and then those have various types of selectors. We're just going to look at two types of selectors for now. The element selector, and the way the element selector is, all of those elements are going to be styled that way. So in this case, all paragraphs are going to be dark red and indented. but we said that might be just too broad, that might be too, too much. We need something a little bit more fine-grained. And then here we have the class. Notice that I called this announcement. So let me take a step back. If I've got some sort of navigation on a page, let's bring up maybe IRC for an example, or W3 Schools works just as well. So they've got a top navigation and a side navigation. Why do you think, if I were to have some classes, do you think top navigation, do you think that would be a good class name or a bad class name? Good. Any votes for bad? So it's probably not apparent. This is probably one of the things that you probably wouldn't have necessarily learned in class. It's just like an experience thing. When you're naming these classes, you want to name them what they are or what they do, not where they're located. So I might name this primary navigation. What do you think the advantage of naming this primary navigation versus top navigation as my class name? So think about this. Sites change sometimes. Over the years, you might do a site redesign. What if I took this navigation and I just flat out got rid of this and I put this on the side? And my class name was top nav, but it's actually on the side. So you kind of want to name it more like what it's doing. Does that make sense? It's still the primary navigation no matter where it is on the page, because that's its purpose. And that's why I named this announcement. I'm saying its purpose. This is going to be like for a class announcement or something like that. I could have named it red italic or some name like that. But then if you change it and it's no longer red or italic or a certain spot on the page, it's kind of a silly name. So, and I wasn't really expecting anybody to know that. That's just kind of one of the things that, unless somebody told you, it's not necessarily always super apparent. By the way, you'll see all kinds of professional web developers doing that all the time. So if you make that mistake, don't feel too bad, because I see code like that all the time. Okay, so let's, everyone's good so far? Let's take this and extend it a little bit further. So rather than starting from scratch, let's go ahead and copy and paste all this code into a new example. This will be the final thing we do for today. Oops. Let's try this again. This is going to be ex4.html. So this last thing I want to talk about is we've got this acronym, CSS, stands for Cascading Style Sheets. We've seen the style part of it. It can change colors. Next class we'll see that we can actually do layouts and put things on different parts of the page. But what's this cascading thing all about? So let's talk about that a little bit. So I've got this class called announcement. What if I wanted another class called due date? And I'm just making up a bunch of arbitrary properties. I just want to get some practice. And let's say it's green. Once we get later in the course, we'll start to do more serious layouts. This part's just to get you, the wheels turning again on all these different CSS rules. Trying to think how I want to do this without being confusing. Okay, so in a lot of your classes, even I don't necessarily always teach it, you can actually apply multiple classes. And all you have to do is have a space between them. So here you can see that this is an announcement, but it's also a due date. So if I just put a space between here, I can apply both. I can apply the announcement and the due date. Now it becomes a little bit unclear because most people here, you'd see that, okay, it's going to be italicized and it's going to be underlined, but what color is it going to get? It's a little bit unclear which color it's going to get. And it's going to get green. The reason being is because how these are processed. They're processed in order. So it first applied the announcement, it made it red and italicized, and then it applied due date. So then it was, in addition to the other things, it's now also underlined, but hey, we already had a color, so it's going to overwrite that color. We'll get into that a little bit more next class about the cascading part. I just want you to be aware of that, is that you don't just, you don't have these things independent of each other. It becomes much, much more useful if you can apply multiple styles to something and come up with a final result. Okay. So, but I think that's a good stopping point for today. No assignment this week, but we'll definitely do an assignment next week. It'll be in class. If you have your own personal laptop, you're more than welcome to bring that and get brackets set up, and then that way you have your assignments in one spot. Brackets, it's a very lightweight piece of software. You don't have to pay for it. It's from Adobe, so I'm assuming you can trust it that it's not a giant virus, right? So if you prefer to work on your own personal laptop, you can do that as well. Okay. So I think this is a good breaking point. Any questions at all regarding the class itself, grading procedures, assignments, any of that sort of stuff, or the actual content? Yeah.
I have a question. It always goes in the order of the top, right? So like if you put due date first and then announcement in like the paragraph tag, it would still do announcement first and then due date, right?
No, it goes by here. So now it would, hold on, let me reload it. Well, now it's not working right. Well, we'll save that for next week. I'll go over that. We'll go over the rules in more detail. I think you are. No, I think you're right. I think it's, well, I don't know. We'll worry about that next week. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Same thing. I use them interchangeably. Okay. And by the way, I will post these videos in case, I know some people fall behind, but don't miss class because you know the video is going to be posted. Use that as more like, oh, I fell a little bit behind. I need review on a subject. Use the videos for that, or have an emergency, something happened where you couldn't make it to class. Don't just assume I can stay home and watch the videos. Okay, like I said, the first half of the lecture, or the first half of class is going to be lecture, but then the whole second half of the class we're going to be doing in-class stuff. Okay. Okay. All right. Good first week. Enjoy the rest of your classes this week, and I'll see everybody for next class.